If we're a self-organizing team, we're relying on ourselves to do process improvement, to understand how we work and what would work better.
And the ability to self-organize and improve our work has been one of the key aspects of agile software development. But recently, so-called spec-driven development has made the claim that in this age of AI-assisted coding, agile development practices are a thing of the past. But is that really the case? That's what I wanted to find out with my guest, Graham Lee, in this week's episode. I guess that many of you will have heard of vibe coding by now. It's effectively a way to let coding-assisting AI tools create entire applications for you, with you supplying the prompts and details in plain language of what it is you want. The term was coined only last year, but it has quickly entered the vernacular of software engineering. What maybe you haven't heard of is spec-driven development. It's another form of development practice based on generative AI tools, and it is, like vibe coding, pretty recent. The first time I heard about spec-driven development was by reading a blog post written by Graham Lee, my guest for this episode. And in this blog post, Graham was responding to some people claiming that spec-driven development is going to replace agile software development practices. All of them. And I confess that I was a bit surprised when I read that, because spec-driven development, to me at least, sounds an awful lot like what we now call waterfall. Waterfall being the process in which you spec everything first, then you write the code, then you test, and then you deliver it. The way this kind of sequential development process was implemented in organizations turned out to be rather rigid, bureaucratic, and inflexible, and it's been blamed on many ills that beset software development in the 1980s, 1990s, and the early millennium years. And agile software development practices were meant to be a response to all of this. And if you have been to any training courses on Scrum and Kanban, as I have, which by the way are arguably the most widely spread agile practices today, you'll get it hammered into your brain that waterfall is the bogeyman, the Freddy Krueger of software engineering. It's not like agile itself hasn't drawn any criticism. Since methods like Scrum or Kanban have entered the mainstream, there have been a few people ringing alarm bells about the way agile development has turned out to be, and Graham and I touch on that in our conversation shortly. But back to spec-driven development. What does the term actually mean? For that, let me turn to an excellent blog post written by Brigitte Böckler. In there she writes, and I'm quoting, "Spec-driven development means writing a spec before writing code with AI documentation first. The spec becomes the source of truth for the human and the AI. In short, it's a process where you iterate through refining your requirements down to individual coding tasks using generative AI tools." Brigitte drills into further details about what that means in practice and also discusses some of the tools that have become available, one of which is a tool by GitHub, by the way, called SpecKit. I can only recommend you read this post and the links in the show notes. Now, like code-generating AI tools, specifications can be generated with AI pretty quickly. And so some people started to wonder, what need is there to go through sprints, sprint cycles, product reviews, and all the other things people might do when they use, for instance, Scrum? One of those people is Kleber de Lima, who wrote in a public post, and again I'm quoting, "The cost of code generation has collapsed. What once took developers days now takes AI minutes. Agile assumed producing code was expensive because human effort was expensive, so the methodology optimized for producing less code more carefully. AI inverts this completely. Generation is now cheap. The constraint is no longer writing code, but specifying what code to write and validating that the result is correct." And further down in the blog post it reads, "Self-organization means something different when the team includes AI. The tacit knowledge that self-organizing human teams surfaced through collaboration must now be made explicit so AI can act on it. Architecture decisions, coding standards, domain models, interface contracts, everything humans once held in their heads must be written down as context for AI consumption. Of course, there are also other and quite different voices who are a little bit more skeptical when it comes to spec-driven development replacing current software development practices, whether it's agile or not. And with regards to self-organizing teams, well, that takes us back to what Graham mentioned right at the beginning. I met with Graham a while ago to discuss his blog post and find out from him why he believes that the principles of agile development practices are still relevant today. Graham is no stranger to the RSE community. In fact, I talked to him for an episode a while back when he was studying the emerging community of research software engineers in more detail, and he actually gave a presentation at one of the RSE conferences on this. So here's Graham now.
My name's Graham. I have a PhD in research software engineering, which I just graduated a couple of weeks back, actually, in January.
Exactly, yeah.
The topic of that was really a sort of social sciences study of how research software engineers work with each other and work with the researchers and other stakeholders in their work. Kind of came up with some recommendations for how to put the field into a sort of more stable footing for RSEs themselves, for researchers, PIs, funders. But I guess we're not really here to talk about that, although,
interesting as it is. But
yes, and
we talked about your PhD while you were still doing it, I think,
right.
in the first show, didn't we?
Yes, that's right. So since then, I've moved around a bit. I worked for a big tech company in Silicon Valley for a few years, working on documentation for their APIs and their software development kits. But now I'm self-employed, and what I'm trying to do is to find ways for software engineers to use the new kind of generation of AI augmented coding assistants in a thoughtful way that helps us to improve our understanding of software engineering and to become better engineers, rather than finding ways to just outsource all of our work to an AI.
Which brings us kind of close to the subject for today, because you've written a blog post recently, or at least I picked it up recently on LinkedIn, I think, with regards to spec-driven development. Is it going to replace agile software development practices? We're going to share the link to that paper in the show notes, but maybe you can quickly take us through what made you write it and what's the gist of that article.
Okay, so let's start with just outlining what these two things are so that we agree what we're talking about. Yeah. So spec-driven development is a way to interact with these large language model-based coding assistants. So things like Claude Code, Gemini CLI, GitHub Copilot, Mistral, there's various different providers. The way that spec-driven development works is instead of just typing a prompt and trying to get the model to generate the code that does what you describe in the prompt, you type a prompt and get the agent to create a specification, like a requirements document that embodies what you wrote in that prompt.
Right.
And then from there, you get the agent to read that requirements document and come up with a list of coding tasks. And then you get it to implement all of those tasks. And so you kind of break down the process between your initial prompt and the code that the model generates through this intermediate sort of specification. Then agile software development is based on this manifesto from very early in this millennium, where people who were doing what were then called lightweight development methodologies said, we have found that the best way to write software is not to kind of focus on documentation and on process and on tools, but on delivering working software to the customer and on accepting change and interacting with the customers and everybody else on the team as kind of professional individuals. So the question has come up on the internet recently from a few places, and I've sent a few links which we'll put in the show notes, I'm sure, so people can see the whole discussion. But people have been saying, does the success of spec-driven development mean that we don't need to do agile anymore, that we can go back to this kind of waterfall approach of specifying what we do up front and then implementing it from that detailed specification. So that's the context in which I wrote this post.
I think there are a couple of different conversations that we need to have about this. First of all, spec-driven development in the context that you've just mentioned. And is there an impact on agile software methodologies as they were laid out in the manifesto, I think 25 years ago or so? But also there is, for some time now, if people follow things on YouTube or podcasts or articles and blog posts, some question marks about agile software development practices themselves. At least I have seen for a number of years now articles and YouTube videos where the question was, or not the question, but sort of the statement was made, agile is dead. Do you think that this plays a kind of a role in this debate as well, this approach to agile methodologies and its manifestation today in companies and organizations?
I think that's right. I think that people are looking for reasons to escape what Ron Jeffries calls dark scrum, which is...
I haven't heard that before.
Right. So, I'll add a link to what he's written about it as well. So this is really the managerialization of Agile. Looking at the principles behind the Agile Manifesto, and I have this open on my screen so I can quickly refer to it.
Me too.
It says things like, our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Well, that sounds like very difficult to argue with, right? If you are a manager of a software development team, you're not going to say, no, we don't want to deliver valuable software to our customer. That's entirely not what we're here for. So that is not the place where this stuff is breaking down. Two principles that have been, I think, the hardest for some teams to follow are one that says, build projects around motivated individuals, give them the environment and support they need, and trust them to get the job done. And the other is, the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. So from that context, and remembering where we were in 2001, I was starting to enter the industry then. That was a revolutionary document. That was saying, the job of a programmer is not to type in the code that a manager asks them to do based on a detailed system requirements specification or product requirements document or whatever the really long tome was called. It was to work out what they needed to do and to do it themselves. That doesn't mean doing away with the management class entirely. It's not quite like a sort of Marxist overthrow of software engineering, but what it is it's saying we need servant leaders. We need people who understand how we're blocked and how to remove those obstacles and how to sort of smooth out our paths, but not to tell us what to do. We need to have the autonomy to do a good job. I summarized the entire Agile Manifesto in this blog post we're talking about as we promise to do good work making software if you promise to let us do good work making software. That contract can be hard for some managers to implement because they're getting pressure from the management above. They want to see results, so they want to have clear insight into what's going on. They want to be able to control it, to change what's happening, to improve outcomes, because that's what they're being asked to do. And so we end up with a situation where a lot of the processes that were supposed to be, in the Scrum guide, the process that's laid out is supposed to be a starting point that you then take and you tweak to your own needs and your own context. Well, it kind of becomes ossified as a control and feedback loop for the managers. And so there's no way for the team to change how frequently they do retrospectives, what they're allowed to say in a retrospective, how frequently they do status updates, how the planning sessions are run. And so it doesn't become a self-organizing team that's adapting to its customers' needs and to improving its own capabilities. It becomes a team that, ironically, has even more managerial oversight and control than a team following a traditional process like a waterfall or the rational unified process or any of the things that came before Agile. Because instead of talking to their managers, at the kind of development phase entry and development phase exit, which are 18 months apart, they now have to do it every 2 weeks.
Indeed. And I do remember that at the time, I was working for Sony in 2000, between 2000 and 2004. And I was a contractor who introduced us to extreme programming. And I found that really revolutionary in many ways. And I learned so much about it. But it was kind of frowned upon by management because there was this kind of idea of self-organizing teams, 2 people sitting in front of a computer instead of one, which seemed to be a waste of time because it would be less productive, and so forth and so forth. But suddenly, well, not suddenly, but over the years, then I noticed that it's become mainstream. When we say mainstream agile software development practices, we actually talk, as you just said, Scrum mainly, right? So this kind of ossified, I like that phrase, ossified process of daily stand-up where you have to tell what you've done the previous days, which sounds very much like justification. You have to justify what you've done the day before. You weren't just sitting on your thumb. And I had teams, and I think it was at a company, Elsevier, I mean, I can say that now, where I was seconded in a different team. And they were beaten up by the product managers because their velocity, the way they work through tickets in a backlog during an iteration was less in this iteration than it was the week before. So you got all these kind of micromanagement techniques that kind of crept in that made managers love Scrum and developers really hate it.
and it's challenging because you do need, at some level, to provide visibility onto what you're doing. Now, what the Agile Manifesto says is that the way you do that is you ship software to your customer and you check whether your customer's happy. But in many contexts, you don't actually have the direct access to your customer that you need. They say that like business people and developers, actually, this is one of, I think, 2 things that I consider to be downsides of the way that the Agile Manifesto is worded. One is this separation into business and developer. You get the technical and the non-technical people, and that allows for a level of distrust, level of sort of separation between the two. When what they're trying to say is all of the people need to work together on one team, but they did it by categorizing them into these 2 people. You don't always get that opportunity. I've worked on a team, probably not better off not saying who they are because a lot of them are in our community and a lot of their customers are in our community. But it was a team where there was a very small number of very expensive customers because it was high performance computing. And that meant that you couldn't just speak to them face to face because they might be over in like Oak Ridge National Labs in the States and we're in somewhere in the UK. So they're not going to like attend our meetings. They're not going to even be available on a call every day to say like, this is how we're using the software. So as soon as you lose that immediacy of feedback with the customer, managers are rightly going to ask, well, how do we know that we're on track? We need to measure something else. And so the velocity, which is something that Scrum introduces to provide a kind of blame-free forecasting technique that's based on yesterday's weather, right? We know that this is what we managed to do over the last 2 weeks, so we'll guess that we'll do about the same over the next 2 weeks. But now that it's the only thing you can measure, it becomes the only thing you can control as well. And so it becomes a point of pressure from the management because they can't readily see how well you're satisfying your customers. They have to see how well you're doing this velocity measurement instead.
Yeah, it becomes quite difficult, as you say, because for a lot of us, and I had similar experiences to you, where we were not in our team directly exposed to customers and we weren't presenting them every week or every day what we're doing and the shiny new software that we developed. And also that the software is sometimes broken down into different components where it's very difficult to actually show just one. So there may be a team like in a big word processor, you might be working on one particular feature that actually, for end users, the only thing that matters really is the final product containing all of the features, not just that one particular one. So it's difficult. So how realistic is it then that we maintain this kind of direct immediacy between developers and customers and in the way that it's written in the manifesto for agile software development? Is it still practical then to do, you think?
I think it's practical. I think it's contextual. And maybe that's a point that we've kind of not appreciated about the Agile Manifesto when we try to apply it to all of software development, Yeah, I mean, the people who wrote it worked in various contexts. Like some of them worked for electronics companies like Tektronix. Some of them were already kind of consultants who worked with software teams. I think one of them was at CERN, actually. They worked in different contexts, but they did work in these small teams that talked directly to their customers. And maybe we need to remember that and to say, like, this is the context in which this works well. If you can't do that, then you need to do something else. But maybe the principles of like fast feedback, of focusing on providing value to your customers still apply. I said before, I was working for a big tech company. I've actually worked for two over my career. I've worked for Facebook, please don't hold that against me, and for Apple. Again, you your opinions on them are your own.
Judgment, Graham. No judgment.
Thank you. Anyway, so I've worked for Facebook and Apple over my career, and you cannot, if you have 2 billion customers, have a meeting with them every day. That's just not going to work. Yeah, there's not enough time in the day. What they tend to do is to use a combination of sampling techniques, so maybe sending out surveys to people, running focus groups, and then telemetry. So just going, how much does this feature get used? How long do people use it for? Do they get all the way through a particular process before they drop off? And particularly Facebook do a lot of that. And then they kind of use that as a statistical measurement of how their customers are engaging with the features they develop. And so you use those kind of large number models to decide what they do with their software engineers.
The principles for me for agile software development practices was always to incrementally inch forward and not try to overcomplicate and over-engineer solutions, rather than try something out, see if it works, and if it works, then move on to the next step. So there's kind of inching forward rather than having, okay, this is the full specification of what we do. We understand the system that we're going to build end to end, and then we're going to do it, which is the classical waterfall model. Although I've never really seen waterfall that way implemented in companies, by the way, but that's a different subject. So they always worked in some kind of iterative manner. But the inching forward, sort of incrementally, step by step, and at every single step you check what you do and you validate what you do before you move on to the next one. And I think for me, that's the takeaway that still holds, despite the fact that we may not have immediate contact with our customers.
Absolutely. It's like, where are we now? Where are our customers now? Where do our customers want to be? And what is the most valuable thing we can do right now to get our customers to where they want to be? It does say agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. That is absolutely one of the critical things about the agile approach to building software. Yeah.
So going back to spec-driven development, it reads a little bit like waterfall model, as these agile courses tell you. You know, you have the big evil waterfall where you write for months on end specs to the last function that you're going to implement. And then you implement it, and you test it, and then you deliver, and you find out you're over budget and time. Anyway, but spec-driven development is now driven by AI agents and AI coding assistants. And yes, I've seen some of the posts that you shared with me before the interview, where some argue, okay, well, that's going to replace agile software development practices. But I think you took a different view of that, didn't you?
Yeah, so I take the view that spec-driven development is a tool that a software developer uses to create code. Now, at the point that you write the code, you are describing precisely a particular process that you want a computer to follow. It doesn't matter whether you have all of your requirements in a detailed form up front, if you base your requirements on conversations that you have every day with a customer, if you're just guessing. It doesn't matter what you've done up to that point. What you get the computer to do when it either runs your source code or compiles it and runs the executable is a particular and entirely specified process. Now, the question is, how well does that process reflect what the customer is trying to tell you to do, or is trying to tell you that they want to do? And saying this tool means that you stop talking to your customer and you go away and write specifications for months is a bit bizarre. It's a bit like asking the question, is it possible to be agile if I use the Emacs text editor? Or which of GDB and LLDB is the agile debugging tool? Like,
yes.
they're things for creating and understanding software, which we do in the context of a process where we understand what our customers want and how we're going to give it to them. So spec-driven development doesn't stop you doing agile. It doesn't stop you doing waterfall. It doesn't force you to do either of these things, because they are about the human to human interaction. And what you do to get an executable program out of your computer is like the human to computer task. This is a tool that kind of mediates that task.
And yet, one of the posts that I saw was talking about humans and their deficiencies. I mean, it was almost like he was writing about a different species and, and not thinking himself to be human. But that's, the people can read it for themselves when they follow the link. But he was under the impression that spec-driven development, because he can create, as he said it, entire applications in minutes, where agile software development practices took several iterations and humans took too long to actually produce it, that it not only replaces ultimately the agile software development practice, but also the agile software developer or developer in general.
Yeah.
What my concern is that there is this kind of marketing spiel now. I don't know if that's changed in the meantime, because that was from 2025 during the peak of the hype. But there is this marketing spiel that CEOs might actually listen to and think, oh, well, I can replace all my developers now with an AI agent.
Here we are marketing the opposite, and we just need to make sure the CEOs listen to your podcast. So anyone who's out there listening, share this link with your CEO. Yeah, I think that's the article where they said, like, the problem with waterfall was that it took people so long to go through all these phases. So this touches on, I said earlier that the separation of people into like business people and developers was one of the two mistakes that I find in the Agile Manifesto. The other is there is only one of the principles that gives any specific numbers on what they're trying to do. It says, deliver working software frequently from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with a preference to the shorter timescale. And this author picked up on that, and they said that Agile says that you should ship every 2 weeks. That's really slow these days, therefore Agile is bad. I think that phrasing is bad. Going back to what we were saying about the kind of context in which it was written, in 2001, that was revolutionary. I worked for a team that between 2007 and 2009 delivered one version of its software following a waterfall implementation. As you say, a sort of one with some iterations in it, as was common. So this company that was shipping software every 2 years was told, no, you can do it every 2 weeks. That just, that's factor of 50 improvement in the frequency of getting updates out. That doesn't make any sense if you're in that context. That is completely miraculous or inhuman in some way. Anyway, diabolical maybe rather than miraculous. But it's just inconceivable.
Yeah.
These days, if you're writing software as a service, you can push changes multiple times a day, and most of your customers will never notice. They might, see that one of their features changes, but if you're shipping changes to other features, or you're shipping performance improvements or things that apply to the back-end implementation, they won't notice at all. So you could have release frequencies like once every 10 minutes or even faster than that. That doesn't mean that you're not being agile. It just means that you've kind of gone past this unfortunately bounded window in the principles that says that you should release software every 2 weeks.
Which is also, by the way, where all these Scrum iterations come from, or sprints, as they're called. There's this miraculous 2 weeks in which everything gets resolved. But very often you end up something like that can be shipped today, as you said. And many companies actually do that, sort of web application. I think Facebook does this as well, but there's at least a few releases in a day,
absolutely,
depending on what it is. And many companies do that, in fact.
Yeah, and so we come back to the question, do you have to avoid responding to changeover or following a plan? Do you have to avoid valuing working software over comprehensive documentation? Do you have to avoid valuing individuals and interactions over processes and tools in order to get down to that 10-minute cycle? Because if you don't change your value structure, then you're still doing something that would be recognized as agile software development. And the other really important point about questioning whether what you're doing counts in some way as agile or not is the very first sentence in the manifesto says, we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. So this is a practitioner-led form of practice improvement. through trying things out and seeing what works. Which means that, yes, we absolutely should take spec-driven development seriously and say, does this work? And if it works in our context, we should discover how we can apply it to provide better value to our customers. If it doesn't work in our context, or if it doesn't provide our customers with better values, then yes, we should go, this isn't going to work for us, we're not going to adopt it. But as I said before, it's a tool. We can choose whether or not we apply any tool, just as we can choose whether we use a particular programming language or a particular library or a text editor or whatever else.
Yeah, I think that's a nice takeaway, to look at these tools as what they actually are. They are tools. So you are still the developer. You're still in charge on using these tools in order to get something done and out of the way. And if it helps you doing that, then fine.
Yeah, and if you don't have the autonomy to choose what tools and practices you use to get the most out of your time as a software developer, then there fundamentally is a problem. Going back to what we were saying about dark Scrum and about the kind of managerial approach to agile software development, that is a bigger issue. Is are you actually allowed to try things and find out what works?
And in that context, I feel that the manifesto of agile software development is still as revolutionary today as it was then, because we're still faced with a situation where we don't have that autonomy. Right. And I think it was Dave Thomas who said that he was railing against agile written with a capital A. Right?
I'm not going to show you my notes for this talk.
And which I find entertaining, but also quite true, because he said there's a whole consultancy who turned it actually upside down, because I've seen in many companies that actually, rather than interactions and individuals over processes and tools, it's processes and tools over interactions and individuals, right? So we have to have a 2-weekly cycle. We have to have lots of colorful post-it notes on glass bowls.
And if we go, right, we have to choose spec-driven development, we have to use that, then we're making the same mistake.
Yeah.
Or if we say that you're not allowed to use spec-driven development, we're making the same mistake. We're prioritizing our choice of tool over the values of working with our customers to deliver the software they need.
So spec-driven development, as defined as that, is really orthogonal to agile development practices, is what we're saying. They're really two different things.
And on your point about revolutions, the revolutions do get diluted as they spread out amongst people. We go from the person who had the idea explaining it to the people that they can talk to the telephone game where they explain it to some people and then they explain it to some people. Two other examples from the software development world. One is free software. This was created in the 1980s. The GNU project was 1985.
Yes.
Very, very principled approach by Richard Stallman, saying that we need to give people the freedom to use software however they want, to study it, to improve it, and then to share their improvements with the community so that we get an intellectual commons based around having the best software that does exactly what you need. Over time, free software became open source software, so that this idea of freedom or things that are free wouldn't scare businesses. And now we're in a phase where people are saying, okay, we don't want people to have the freedom to use the software however they want, because we don't want our competitors to have access to the software on the same standing that we do. So we get things like the server-side public license, which claims to be open source, but it doesn't let competitors run software as a service. That was the example of open source. The other example I would pick is object-oriented software, which started in Xerox PARC as a way to teach computing to 8-year-olds, to children, by letting them simulate the real world in software by equating real-world objects with virtual objects in the software system. And that over time gave rise to C++ and Java, which is so complex that professional programmers can spend a lifetime trying to understand all the intricacies and still not get it right. Has also gone from there used to be whole methodologies of object-oriented analysis and design.
UML.
Yeah, the UML modeling language, the use case documents that Eli Jacobson promoted, where you started your conversation with the customer, you understood what they wanted, you wrote it down in terms of objects and their interactions with each other, and then you followed that all the way through development and testing and deployment. You had object-oriented deployment diagrams and object-oriented approaches to understanding which components went on which computer in your server room and so on. These days, what we do is we teach kind of classes and polymorphism to developers, and we tell them that object-oriented programming is a way to structure your code. We've kind of shrunk down all of this other stuff that made it an entire, literally a paradigm, a way of thinking about your problem. We turned it from a paradigm to a programming technique. So yeah, these things do get diluted, and the way to kind of up the concentration, as it were, to get out of this homeopathic approach to agile that we've got at the moment.
I like that.
Well, it is to strengthen the story. It is to have those revolutions over and over again. Take DevOps, for example. What does DevOps say? It says that our software developers and our operations people should talk to each other and should work on the same goal that satisfies the customer needs. That's exactly what the Agile Manifesto says. We just had to say it again so that people would pay attention again and would try to do that again. And now that's kind of been diluted. We have separate like DevOps teams who sit between the developers and operations and act as a kind of a boundary between them. So that revolution needs to happen again. It needs to happen again and again and again in order to stay current, in order to stay relevant, and for people to actually take away the fundamental message, not to just make superficial tweaks to their processes so that they can check a box or get a certification that says that they're doing this thing.
Indeed. So how can we save Agile from itself? Can we?
Well, can we? I think we absolutely can. So at the kind of macroscopic scale, we need to do what I just said. And we're doing that right now. We're having this conversation. We're putting these values and these principles back into the core of the discussion. And people will listen to this. And some people will go, oh, I can't do that in my team and my context. So that's fine. Some people will say, oh yeah, I can make this change. And we will move the pendulum back somewhat. What an individual can do, or a team, needs to be in a position of self-organization. There's two things here. One is you need support from your managers to actually be able to do that. You need to have a constructive enough relationship with your manager that you can say, hey, this thing that we're doing, we think it's wrong. We want to do it this other way, and we want your support in doing it this other way. That is in dialogue with the manager. So it's partly up to them to kind of accept that, but it's also up to us as the practitioners to empower ourselves to even have that conversation, not to wait for our manager to tell us or to ask us what we want, but to say to them, this is what we need. And we need to acknowledge our weaknesses in that. If we're a self-organizing team, we're relying on ourselves to do process improvement, to understand how we work and what would work better. If we're not good at that, then very easy to slide back into those kind of dark scrum patterns because we go, okay, we don't really know how to get better. This book, this guide says that we should work this way. Let's just follow that.
Yeah.
So if we're not good at that, then we need to acknowledge that and get support. And that support may come from our management. It may come from an external trainer. It may come from reading a book and trying things out. But really, that's what it is understanding what we're good at, getting permission and autonomy to do the things we're good at, and understanding what we're not good at and getting help somehow.
I'm going to return to the subject of agile software development in a couple of weeks' time when you will hear from one of the authors of the so-called Agile Manifesto, Dave Thomas. But before then, we have other fish to fry, or bits, I should say, and in particular, how they can rot, no matter which device you store them on. And in my quest to find out more about it, I met with 3 experts in the field which will lead us, amongst others, to the British Library and the Centre for Computing History in Cambridge in the UK. I hope you tune in then. Many thanks for listening. Oh, time's up. See you next time. But before I forget, this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons license. See ya.